They are not just scrapping targets. They are ripping up the law that made Britain the first major economy to hardwire net zero into national life, and they say it will save tens of billions while cutting bills. Critics warn it will do the opposite and lock the country into higher costs and lost industries. Who? Nigel Farage of Reform UK and Kemi Badenoch, Conservative leader, are driving parallel agendas to abandon the United Kingdom's net zero commitments and expand North Sea oil and gas. What? Farage proposes scrapping net zero to free up roughly £30 billion per year and redirect spending, while Badenoch pledges to repeal the Climate Change Act 2008 outright and replace it with a new energy plan prioritizing security and cost. When? The pledges escalated through autumn 2025, with Badenoch's repeal vow surfacing in early October and Farage pressing a cost-saving anti-net zero platform across 2025. Where? This fight sits at the core of United Kingdom national policy because the Climate Change Act provides the legal framework for net zero and 5-year carbon budgets overseen by the Independent Climate Change Committee. The Climate Change Act 2008 created a legally binding pathway to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, introducing 5-year carbon budgets and establishing the Independent Climate Change Committee to advise and monitor progress, later strengthened in 2019 to a net zero by 2050 target in law. Kemi Badenoch now promises to repeal that act if the Conservatives return to government, arguing that the framework imposes burdensome rules, raises bills, and harms industrial competitiveness, while promising cheaper, more reliable energy through an alternative strategy and more North Sea extraction. Farage's Reform UK argues that scrapping net zero would yield approximately £30 billion a year in savings by cutting green subsidies and programs, part of a broader pledge to repurpose funds and deregulate, including claims of very large 5-year savings to fund tax and family giveaways. Industry and expert pushback is intense. Business and green groups warn that abandoning the act would undermine energy security and deter investment, with trade associations and analysts noting that renewables costs have fallen and that policy stability enables private capital and jobs in clean technology. Independent explainers stress what the act does and does not do, highlighting its role as a long-term, evidence-based framework that translates the 2050 goal into near-term carbon budgets and requires government transparency and parliamentary oversight.
The clash is not only ideological, it is institutional, because the Climate Change Act is the backbone for policy, budgets, and accountability, and repealing it would remove the legal scaffolding that steers ministers across decades.
That is precisely why repeal is a big line to cross. It signals a shift from an evidence-anchored, budgeted approach to a discretionary one, and markets read that as policy risk, which can raise the cost of capital and slow project deployment in energy infrastructure.
Badenoch's case hinges on the claim that the act raises bills and harms growth, but whether repeal lowers bills depends on wholesale market exposure and technology costs, because North Sea oil and gas are sold into global markets and do not guarantee lower domestic prices.
Investors in renewables and storage emphasize that stable frameworks bring private money. Industry groups argue that reversing course jeopardizes jobs and supply chains that have grown under the current legal certainty, particularly in solar and battery storage.
Farage's numbers are central. Reform's public pitch has repeatedly cited savings of about £30 billion annually from ending net zero-related spending, but independent scrutiny points to lower average public investment costs in decarbonization when spread over time.
BBC Verify noted that the average annual public investment cost of decarbonization is estimated at around £9.9 billion over a 25-year period in official fiscal assessments referenced in debate, which materially undercuts the claimed £30 billion per year saving headline.
If the act is repealed, the legal duty to meet net zero by 2050 disappears, along with carbon budgets and formal oversight, unless a replacement framework replicates those functions. That would be a constitutional-level rewire of energy and climate governance.
And the Climate Change Committee's role comes from statute, providing independent advice and progress reports. Removing or bypassing that statutory advisory and accountability loop would fundamentally alter how long-term targets are translated into policy.
Badenoch frames this as liberation from red tape and court challenges, highlighting examples like complex biomass subsidy controversies and planning delays, with the promise of faster, cheaper energy and more security through domestic extraction and new rules.
However, critics counter that scrapping the framework adds uncertainty, undermines investor confidence, and risks higher long-run system costs if the transition slows, while climate risks like floods and heat waves carry their own economic burden if undermanaged.
It is also a strategic industry question. The global race for green technology is accelerating, with major economies subsidizing supply chains, and a policy vacuum could see manufacturing and innovation shift abroad, weakening the United Kingdom's industrial base.
The original Act's architecture was designed to take politics out of the day-to-day by embedding a destination and a paced pathway. Unpicking that puts politics back in the driving seat every budget cycle, which can swing investment cycles erratically.
Farage's alternative is a fossil-first bridge: drill more and deregulate. His pitch ties to broader fiscal promises and anti-Quango cuts, positioning net zero as a cost center that blocks tax and welfare giveaways. But many decarbonization costs are front-loaded public investments that can crowd in larger private capital, and over time, renewables and efficiency can reduce exposure to volatile fossil prices, which is a core argument of the business and green coalition.
For older viewers, the practical lens is bills, reliability, and pensions. Whatever the pathway, the critical questions are whether policy choices meaningfully cut wholesale exposure, improve insulation and heating efficiency, and keep networks stable in winter peaks.
The repeal route would need a fully worked-out alternative: capacity planning, storage build-out, market reform, and a resilience plan for gas and power price shocks. Without that, repealing creates a void rather than a bridge, which markets and households will quickly feel.
There is also the international signal. The Act has been cited globally as the model for binding climate law. Repeal would broadcast a retreat, potentially affecting trade diplomacy and green investment partnerships.
Carbon Brief's explainer underlines how the Act translates long-term goals into near-term obligations. Dismantling it without an equivalent instrument risks drifting off any credible pathway, regardless of preferred technologies.
The political calculus is fierce because both leaders are courting the same voters, frustrated by costs and skeptical of elites. But policy durability requires more than slogans. It needs numbers that add up and mechanisms that deliver.
In the end, the test is simple. Will households pay less? Will the system be more secure? And will the United Kingdom keep access to the industries of the future? Any proposal that cannot answer all three risks shortchanging the country.
Should Britain repeal the Climate Change Act and bet on fossil expansion for cheaper energy now, or keep a legally binding pathway and accelerate clean investment to cut bills and risk in the long run? Subscribe to Alert View and activate notifications to receive factual, in-depth breakdowns that cut through the noise and explain how policy choices will affect households, pensions, and national security every week.